first. It's only been a few weeks since Donald Trump shattered the hopes and dreams of journalists around the world by winning a Democratic election. But one network, which honestly spent years referring to Trump as a Nazi and a risk to democracy, well, at least now it's trying to be balanced.
Over the past week, Joe and I have heard from so many people, from political leaders to regular citizens, deeply dismayed by several of President-elect Trump's cabinet selections, and they are scared. Last Thursday, we expressed our own concerns on this broadcast and even said we would appreciate the opportunity to speak with the president-elect himself. On Friday, we were given the opportunity to do just that.
Cue the anger and outrage from their own left-wing audience. And MSNBC's Morning Joe hosts didn't just speak to Trump, they went right into the belly of the beast.
Joe and I went to Mar-a-Lago to meet personally with President-elect Trump. It was the first time we have seen him in 7 years.
Now, we talked about a lot of issues, including abortion, mass deportation, threats of political retribution against political opponents, and media outlets. We talked about that a good bit. And it's going to come as no surprise to anybody who watches this show, has watched it over the past year or over the past decade, that we didn't see eye to eye on a lot of issues, and we told him so.
What we did agree on was to restart communications.
As if Trump would care whether he communicates with MSNBC or not. But MSNBC viewers clearly cared, with the New York Post reporting that less than an hour after this segment aired, viewers abandoned the network. Ratings for the program dropped 38% in the 25 to 54 demographic, which the Post also points out is the demographic that advertisers target. And I wonder why they turned off. You might think a journalist meeting the president-elect is a normal thing, and you'd be right. But the confusion, of course, is that this network has spent years attacking Trump as a threat.
The former and future president is moving quickly to fill the clown car and round out his cabinet before he changes his mind and fires them all.
I mean, he's just going full Nazi here, full fascist.
But once you have radicalized one major party so that those are the preferences of the people who adhere to your party, the leader is interchangeable. And yes, Trumpism is sometimes what we call it. MAGA movement is probably a better way to do it. But there is an authoritarian movement inside Republican politics that isn't being bamboozled by Trump. They are pushing Trump to get more and more extreme, because the more extreme things he says, the more they adhere to him.
Yeah. Where one side stands for freedom while the other meets the textbook definition of fascism, namely a far-right dictatorial regime like Hitler's Germany or Franco's Spain or Mussolini's Italy. We've warned you about Donald Trump's profound unfitness for office. From his theft of classified documents and attempted insurrection to his clear cognitive and physical decline.
MSNBC viewers must be so confused. 1 minute, he's this dictator who's going to steal America, and the next, he is an important source of communication for MSNBC. And we've seen this play out across the media more broadly. Before the election, White House press sec Karine Jean-Pierre regularly made inflammatory comments like this.
How many times do we have to January 6, 2021? That is a fact, what was reported, that happened on that day by some of your colleagues. I mean, and we have, at the same time, denounced political violence over and over, political rhetoric over and over again.
But last week, the man who everyone said was a dangerous threat to democracy, all of a sudden wasn't.
This administration message to millions of Americans that they're going to wake up the day after the election if Trump won and have their rights stripped away, that democracy would crumble, and the president said today we're going to be okay. So how do you square that?
I can't square that. I'm going to square that in a way that hopefully makes sense, because I've been answering this question multiple times. The American people made the decision. There was an election 2 nights ago. There was. And it was a free and fair election, and we respect the election process. We do. And Americans spoke. And so the job of the president is to make sure we respect that. The job of the president is to make sure that we have a peaceful transfer of power.
Well, joining me on the show today is Sky News host Caleb Bond and Sky News contributor Damien Curry. Caleb, let's start with you. I mean, this is essentially MSNBC realising that they can't be a mainstream network anymore. They've essentially radicalised their audience, who turned off the channel the moment they tried to have a conversation.
It's amazing, isn't it? I mean, you know, ordinarily I would say, and I will to some degree in this circumstance, I will say good on Joe Scarborough and his wife, who is his co-host, for actually going and talking to Trump, given they obviously have a clear ideological opposition to him. And that's what any good journalist should do. You ought to deal with people from both sides, and you know, even though viewers would know exactly what I think on most things, because I talk about them every night, I've always prided myself on having contacts and relationships on both sides of politics. Because if you're not willing to understand the other side, then how can you possibly argue in good faith for what you believe in if you can't compare and contrast with things? But when you go on, as you just showed, saying that he's Hitler, he's a fascist, he's a dictator, this will be the end of democracy, there'll never be another election in the US, he's stealing the joint, you'll have no rights, etc., why would you then want to go and sit down with that dude? Like, you can't blame the viewers for being confused that the guy they've been told is literally Hitler is now good to go and have a cup of tea with at Mar-a-Lago.
Welcome, Damien. Let's bring you into this. Right. I mean, Caleb raises such a good point. I mean, honestly, it just reveals that it was political posturing. They're essentially saying to their audience, well, we were kind of being inflammatory and made all that up, so now let's treat this a lot more normally than we were a few weeks ago.
Yeah, I mean, could they have any less credibility? I mean, they deserve to go broke. They deserve to have no ratings. They deserve to not exist or to cease to exist, because it is absolutely appalling stuff that they've been doing for 4 years. I mean, I do a podcast called The Other Side because we want to sit down rationally and talk sensibly about issues from a centre-right perspective with people from the left. The problem, I think, and the distinction we've got to make is between commentary that's all emotionally driven and commentary that's rational. And MSNBC has been the barking mad, irrational, radical left side of things for quite a long time. And if you want to look at it on that scale, you can't say Fox is as irrational as MSNBC. It isn't. It's far more moderated, far more intelligent. CNBC would be the far more intelligent side of the left in the media, but MSNBC is just operating on this sort of hysterical, hyper-emotive nonsense. Now, that is typical of the left itself. I would say there is a tendency on the left to be far more erratic and emotional than on the right. But yeah, I mean, they've just been doing this crazy stuff for so long, for so many years that, you know, their credibility's got to be completely in the toilet by now, right?
Yeah, it's very funny. And look, we had a bit of a laugh when Joy Reid had the wall behind her. It's got Mussolini and Hitler, and she's comparing it to Trump. And we could laugh, but there is a serious element to this. And look, MSNBC is going to MSNBC. That's what they do. But I want to get your reaction to Karine Jean-Pierre, who is, that's an official role. It's the press secretary. It's supposed to be the distribution point from the White House, Caleb, to the American people and the rest of the world. And she's sitting there characterising this election as you mentioned, potentially the last threat to democracy. Brilliant of that Fox News reporter to call her on that, saying, well, hang on, what happened to this threat? Now you're sitting down and Joe Biden's having a cup of tea with him.
As they often do. I mean, Peter Doocy does great work at Fox News, or has done great work calling out the Biden administration, particularly when he faces KJP. But of course, the job of the press secretary of the President of the United States, or any press secretary anywhere in the world for that matter, is to feed lines to the media. They send stuff out there that they hope the media will pick up on. And of course, most of the commercial media in the United States, and even the public media, much like ours here, is left-wing. So they dutifully pick up the lines that get sent out by the press ex and the administration, etc. And they too end up being confused when the people who've been saying that he's Hitler and they've been then repeating these lines suddenly say, well, we're going to have a peaceful and orderly transfer of power here. Everyone has been complicit in this fear-mongering, be it the media or the Biden administration, because they thought they would get away with it. I am convinced that Harris, I mean Biden for some weird reason, probably because his brain's turned to mashed potato, I think did think he could beat Donald Trump before Harris usurped him. And I think Harris was convinced she was going to beat Donald Trump. So they thought that running these lines about Hitler and threat to democracy, etc., was actually going to work, and that they would never have to pay for it in some way. They would never have to later justify what they'd done because they were going to win anyway. They're now in the difficult position of not having won, and so they're backpedaling as fast as possible, which is why.
And I think they're only backpedaling because they've realised
we got it wrong.
Well, exactly. They also realised that it didn't work.
Yes.
And then so now they're trying to change tack. If it did work, I think we'd be seeing a lot more of that rhetoric.